The wire transfer confirmation was still open on his laptop when I walked into the study to ask if he wanted coffee. He didn't hear me come in. He was leaning forward, one hand on the mouse, and on the screen, clear as anything. Right there was my sister's name, Cassandra Wren, and beside it, a number, $5,000, sent. And below that, a date. And below that, another date. And another one after that. He closed the laptop before he turned around. Smoothly, the way someone does when they have been doing something long enough that the covering of it has become its own kind of muscle memory. A reflex, not a decision. "Hey," he said, "did you say something?" I said no. I said I was just checking on the coffee. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter next to the old coffee maker, the one with the cracked handle held together with a strip of black electrical tape, the one we'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. And I stood very still, and I did not make any coffee at all. The refrigerator hummed. The light above the sink buzzed faintly, the way it had been buzzing for a week. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, and then the neighborhood was quiet again. To explain how I ended up standing in that kitchen on that particular Tuesday evening, I need to take you somewhere earlier, somewhere quieter, where the cracks hadn't shown yet, and everything still looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. My name is Sarah Callahan. I'm 43 years old, and I have worked as a senior forensic accountant at a litigation support firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, for the past 11 years. Charlotte is one of those cities that appears to have materialized very quickly. Glass towers and construction cranes and neighborhoods that keep pushing outward into what used to be farmland. But we lived in Dilworth, one of the older parts of the city, where the streets curve under mature oaks and the houses have proper front porches, and people actually wave when they walk past. Our house was a dark green Craftsman with white trim and a brass knocker on the front door that my husband, Joel, had picked out himself when we moved in 6 years ago. He was specific about things like that. Details mattered to him, he always said. I work in a field that most people find either bewildering or deeply boring. And honestly, I understand why. Forensic accounting is not something that lands well at a dinner party. But what it actually feels like from the inside, what it really is a kind of slow, patient archaeology. You are given financial records that someone has deliberately made confusing, or incomplete, or misleading. And your work is to reconstruct what actually happened, to find the true shape underneath the false one that someone built on top of it. I have a particular tolerance, developed over years, for sitting with information that doesn't quite add up and waiting. Not anxiously, not impatiently, until enough pieces surface that the picture becomes clear. That tolerance is probably what made me good at my job. I think it's also the reason it took me longer than it should have to look more carefully at my own life. We see what we are looking for, and I had not been looking. Joel and I met at a fundraising dinner for a local literacy nonprofit, one of those spring events at a garden venue where everyone is dressed slightly more formally than the outdoors warrants, and the conversations are bright and a little effortful. He was there with a work colleague. I was there with my friend Renata, who had dragged me out of what had been a long run of back working weekends, and simply would not hear any excuse I offered. We ended up at the same table for dinner, and he made me laugh 3 times in the first hour, which sounds like a small thing but was, for me, actually quite a lot. He was warm in a way that felt genuine, rather than performed. He remembered small things you mentioned in passing, without emphasis, and came back to them later in a way that made you feel genuinely heard. He was consistent. He showed up when he said he would, which sounds like a very low bar, but it had not always been my experience. And at 36, I had come to understand that consistency was not, in fact, a given. We dated for 2 years, and were thoughtful about it. And then we got married. And the first 4 years of the marriage were, by any honest measure I could apply to them, genuinely good. My sister Cassandra, Cass, always Cass. She'd gone by the short version since her first year of college, and never looked back, was 5 years younger than me. Our relationship was close in the way that adult sisters who live in the same city tend to be close. We saw each other without needing a reason. We called on long drives. We knew things about each other's daily lives without having to be caught up. But there was friction in it too. the quiet kind that comes from being fundamentally different in temperament. Cass moved through the world with a particular intensity, passionate, impulsive, prone to financial instability, brilliant in certain specific ways, and completely unbothered by her own chaos in others. She had lived in 4 different cities in 8 years. She had started 3 small businesses, 2 of which had failed, and 1 of which existed in a state of perpetual almost working, always 6 weeks away from something big. She had borrowed money from our mother at least twice that I knew of. She and Joel had always gotten along easily, naturally. The kind of easy that looks, from a certain angle, like people who simply have compatible personalities. I had always told myself that was a good thing. The first moment something felt slightly off. I was in the kitchen making dinner on a Friday evening in late October. Joel was sitting at the table on his phone. Not unusual at all, but he had shifted the screen away from me in a way that was just slightly too deliberate, not dramatic, just angled. The kind of small physical adjustment you would not notice unless you were someone who spent your professional life noticing exactly that kind of thing. I did not say anything. I finished making dinner, but I put that moment somewhere quietly in the back of my mind. The way you pin a number that doesn't quite reconcile and leave it there for later. On the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I'd placed it after framing it on a slow Sunday afternoon about 2 years prior, there was a photograph Joel and me on a hiking trail in Asheville, the summer we got engaged, both of us windburned and tired and laughing at whoever was holding the camera, a plain wooden frame. Nothing remarkable. I walked past it every single morning while making coffee, and had not really looked at it in a long time. It was just there, part of the texture of the kitchen, the way certain things become part of the texture of a house, and you stop registering them as objects, and they just become atmosphere. The Tuesday it happened, I came home earlier than expected. A client meeting had been rescheduled at the last minute, which freed up most of my afternoon, and I stopped at the farmer's market on the way back. Tomatoes, a bunch of basil, a good loaf of bread. The house was quiet when I came in through the side door. Joel's car was in the driveway, which surprised me. He'd mentioned earlier that week he was running late most evenings. Something about a vendor audit that was dragging on. I set the grocery bags on the counter and heard the sound of him at the keyboard in the study down the hall. I thought, I'll see if he wants coffee. The most ordinary thought in the world. The kind that happens 100 times and leads to nothing. I walked down the hallway. The study door was open, and there it was. His laptop screen, bright in the dimmer light of that room. My sister's full legal name. The number, the timestamp, the word sent, and below it, a list of prior dates running down the page. He closed the laptop before he turned around. Smooth, unhurried. The motion of someone who has been closing things at the right moment for long enough that it has stopped requiring any thought. Hey, he said. Did you say something? No, I said, just checking on the coffee. His voice was exactly the same as always, relaxed, unconcerned. The voice of someone with nothing to hide, or the voice of someone who had been hiding the same things for long enough that it had come to sound exactly the same. I had read that distinction in deposition transcripts more times than I could count. I had never heard it from my own husband's mouth before that evening. I went back to the kitchen. I stood at the counter with my hands resting on the edge of the sink. Not gripping, just resting. The tomatoes were still in the paper bag. The basil smelled sharp and clean. I stood there without moving, without making any noise. And I ran the image back through my mind the way I replay financial data that doesn't match expectations. Slowly, methodically, looking for the detail that explains what I saw. One transfer could be a gift, a loan, something with an ordinary explanation. But the list of dates had been long, the spacing had been regular, monthly, almost certainly, and every amount had been the same. I put the kettle on. I unpacked the tomatoes. I did not go back down the hall that evening. Not yet. In my work, moving before you have enough is how you lose things. You cannot recover. I was not going to move before I was ready. There is a particular discipline in sitting inside knowledge you have not yet acted on, to go about the business of an ordinary evening, making dinner, cleaning the kitchen, responding to a text, while carrying something that new and that significant. I had practiced a version of this professionally for years. The ability to hold a finding without moving too quickly, to let the complete picture develop before you do anything with it. But there is a meaningful difference between exercising that discipline with a client file and exercising it in your own kitchen, while your husband comes in and asks what you want to watch before bed. I said sure, we watched something. I could not tell you what it was. I was present enough to respond if spoken to, absent enough that none of it registered. When he turned off the lights, I lay there in the dark for a while. Then I got up very quietly and went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with just the light above the stove on. And I started writing down exactly what I had seen and what I needed to find out to be certain. That night, after Joel went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea that went completely cold before I touched it. I want to be honest about what those next 10 days actually looked like, because I think people tend to imagine something more dramatic, a confrontation in a hallway, a breakdown at 2 in the morning, something immediate and loud. That was not my experience at all. What those 10 days felt like, from the very first night, was the beginning of a case. The familiar texture of work I had been doing for 11 years, that specific quality of alertness that comes when the first anomaly surfaces, when you already have a strong sense of what you're going to find, and the task in front of you is to document it thoroughly enough that no one can argue with your conclusions later. I started where I always start, with what I could already access. Joel and I kept our finances partly combined and partly separate, a joint account for the household, individual accounts for our personal spending, and he ran his business finances through the consultancy's accounts, which I had never had reason to examine closely. But the joint account, our shared credit cards, our household filing system, those were accessible to me, and I knew exactly how to read them. The joint checking account looked clean on the surface. Groceries, utilities, the mortgage, the expected categories, the transfers I had seen were coming from somewhere else. His personal account or something I didn't yet know existed. Either way, I needed to go further. I started with the credit card statements, and I went back 18 months, not just the current period. There were charges I recognized individually, but had never looked at as a group. A storage facility on the east side of Charlotte, $47 a month. Regular as rent. I had noticed it before and assumed vaguely it was related to his business. He'd mentioned once that he kept some paper client files offsite. I had never questioned it. 3 hotel charges spread across 14 months. Atlanta, Raleigh, Greenville. Each one corresponded with a weekend, when Joel had told me he was at an industry conference. All 3 conferences were real. I had never had any reason to check whether he had actually attended them. A recurring charge to a grocery delivery service, billed monthly to an address on the east side of Charlotte, that was not our address. I wrote all of this down on a yellow legal pad, the same kind I use at work. Thick ruled paper. The kind that forces you to slow down and be deliberate. Old habit. I think more clearly on paper when something matters. I can move too fast on a screen. The grocery delivery address traced to an apartment building called the Meridian. 12 stories, east side, relatively new construction. I had driven past it without ever stopping to think about it. On the 3rd evening, I contacted our bank using the power of attorney documentation. Joel and I had both signed 3 years ago during a joint estate matter. The authorization was technically still valid, and I was meticulous about staying within exactly what it permitted me to request. I documented every step, kept copies of everything, moved no further than the legal authorization allowed, the way I would handle any professional task with legal exposure. What the bank provided confirmed the shape I had already suspected. A secondary personal account in Joel's name, not his business account. A separate personal savings account, opened 26 months ago. Monthly outflows of approximately $5,200, transferred on the 3rd of every month, without exception to an external account. When I ran that receiving account number through the professional databases my firm subscribed to, it came back registered to Cassandra Wren, 26 months. Every month, no missed payments. I did the arithmetic on a fresh sheet of the legal pad. approximately $135,000. I wrote the number down and then I sat with it for a while, not writing anything else, just looking at it. The storage unit registration, when I pulled it up through the county records, showed it had been opened in the same month as the secondary bank account, 26 months ago. I noted that timing carefully and underlined it. On the 6th day, I found the emails. Joel used our shared family tablet for streaming. It sat on the kitchen counter, and both of us used it casually, for recipes, news, weather. He had logged into his personal email account on it at some point, and hadn't logged out. I don't know if it was carelessness or something that had slipped through a moment of distraction. Everything else had been carefully managed. This was the one gap. I sat down at the kitchen table. There were 43 email threads between Joel and Cassandra, covering the previous 8 months alone. I did not read all of them. I read enough to understand the nature of what I was looking at. The relationship, the arrangement, the specific reason the money was moving. And then I stopped and documented precisely what I had found and did not go further than the work required. I was building a record, not looking for more pain than the record needed to contain. What the emails made clear was this. The $5,000 each month was not casual generosity. It was not a secret loan between people who happened to care about each other. It was structured, ongoing, obligatory support. The language both of them used was careful in the way people become careful when they are managing information about something they need to keep contained. But the pattern of that carefulness, the specific things they were being careful about, was completely legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. I called Renata that evening. She has been my closest friend since graduate school. We shared a barely heated apartment in Raleigh for 2 years in our late 20s, back when we were both surviving on ambition and very cheap coffee, and that kind of living together makes a friendship into something that holds differently than most. She is a family law paralegal now, at a firm across town, and she has a quality I genuinely value. She can receive terrible news without making her own reaction the center of the conversation. She listens. She says things that are true when you need them. She stays quiet when that's what's needed. She does not perform. She came over that same evening. I made pasta. Simple. Nothing particular. Just something that needed tending on the stove so my hands had something to do. We sat at the kitchen table, and I walked her through everything I had built in 6 days. The account, the transfers, the hotel dates, the storage unit, the emails. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Genuinely quiet, sitting with it. And then she said, "Sarah, you're not building this because you're trying to figure out what happened. You already know what happened. You're building this so that when you decide what to do, nobody gets to argue with what's true." She was right. I had known what happened from the moment I saw the laptop screen in the study, but hearing it said plainly, hearing it named without softening, was something I had needed without knowing I needed it. Something steadied inside me. I poured more wine and we kept going. She asked if I had checked public records yet. I hadn't. I had been moving through the financial trail first, building outward from the most concrete evidence. We pulled up the county records right there at that table. Before I tell you what I found next, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from? I'm always surprised how far these stories travel. Cassandra did not own property in Charlotte, but she had a registered residential address. The East Side apartment I had already identified through the grocery delivery charge. The Meridian, the same building. I had now connected her address through 3 completely separate sources: the delivery service, the county records, and the building's public registration. That kind of triangulation, in professional work, is what turns a finding from probable to confirmed. I moved to court filings next. Civil matters take patience to search through if you are not exactly certain what you are looking for, and I was not entirely certain. I had a hypothesis, and I was checking it. But I knew the specific databases and the right search parameters, and I worked carefully. There was a sealed filing. Civil matter, filed 27 months ago. 1 month before the secondary account was opened, sealed at the mutual request of both parties. In civil cases, Mutual sealing requests at that level typically indicate one of a small number of sensitive categories: custody arrangements, paternity determinations, medical matters involving a minor, or financial settlements tied to any of the above. I could not access the sealed contents without a court order. But I didn't need to read the contents to understand what the timing meant. 27 months ago, a sealed filing. 26 months ago, a new bank account, and the first transfer. The gap between those two dates was its own statement. Clear enough that I didn't need to see inside the sealed document to know the shape of what it contained. On the 7th day, I went back to the financial records, with a specific question I hadn't fully answered yet. Where was the money coming from inside the consultancy? Joel ran his business from a home office and a small rented suite downtown, and his client billings were handled through the consultancy's main operating account. But a secondary personal savings account, funded at that level, required a consistent source, and business income that moved off the books before hitting the visible accounts was a pattern I had seen in professional litigation work more times than I wanted to count. I pulled together everything I had access to regarding the consultancy's public financial footprint, registered filings, any publicly accessible business records, the expense categorizations visible in the tax documents he kept in the household files, which I had every right to access. The pattern I found was not unusual in its mechanics. It was, in fact, quite ordinary in the specific way that financial deception tends to be ordinary. Revenue from 3 smaller clients, consulting fees, monthly retainer arrangements, had been consistently categorized as business expenses in the household filing copies, while simultaneously appearing in a separate undeclared stream. It was not sophisticated. It didn't need to be. It only needed to be invisible to someone who wasn't looking. And I had not been looking. I noted all of it, photographed the relevant documents, added them to the legal pad in a new section at the back. On the 8th day, Renata called to check in. Not for an update. She just said, "How are you sleeping?" I told her I was sleeping fine, which was strange but true. She said she understood that kind of sleep, the sleep of someone with a defined task moving through it. She stayed on the phone for 40 minutes while I ate dinner alone at the kitchen table, and we talked about almost nothing important, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done for me right then. I did not have to explain anything, or manage anything, or perform anything. I just got to be someone eating dinner and talking to a friend on a weeknight, which felt, for that hour, like the most ordinary and therefore most valuable thing in the world. On the 9th day, I drove to the east side of Charlotte for the first time with deliberate intent. I had been past the meridian before without ever needing to think about it, and now I needed to see it properly. Not for any evidentiary reason, not to do anything there, but because there is a particular kind of understanding that only comes from being physically present at a place that has mattered in a story you're reconstructing. I parked across the street, sat in the car for a while, a 12-floor glass and brick building that looked exactly like every other building of its type. A doorman inside the lobby, a little park area to the left of the entrance with benches, and a piece of metal sculpture that no one had sat near. I drove home. That evening, I sorted everything I had into final order, printed what needed printing, organized the printed records by category, labeled each tab, counted the pages. 61 pages. Total, everything documented, everything dated, everything sequential. I made a pot of coffee at 10 o'clock that night and sat at the dining table and read through all of it from the beginning, the way I would read a final client report before submitting it, checking for gaps, checking for anything I had misread or assumed, checking that the narrative the documents told was coherent and complete. It was coherent. It was complete. There was nothing missing. The picture was whole. By the end of the 10th day, I had 61 pages of handwritten notes and printed records. A complete, sequential financial narrative with dates, amounts, account numbers, and addresses. Documentation of the hotel stays, the storage unit, the email records, the delivery charges, and the sealed filing with its telling timestamp. Everything organized, everything cross-referenced, everything ready. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time that last evening, looking out at the backyard where leaves had been accumulating near the fence for 2 weeks. The rake was leaning against the fence, exactly where I had last put it down, everything just continuing to be what it was. I reached for the framed photograph on the windowsill, both of us on the Asheville Trail, wind-burned and laughing. I actually looked at it properly. For the first time in I couldn't say how long. The plain wooden frame had a hairline crack along the lower left corner. I had no idea when it had happened. I had simply never looked closely enough to see it before. I set it back down, face up, for now. But something had shifted in how I was holding it. And we both knew, the photograph and I, that certain things were now different. Even if nothing had moved yet, I had what I needed. It was time to make the call. I called Sandra Okafor's office the following Monday morning at 8:45. Sandra was a family law attorney whose name had been passed to me by a colleague 18 months earlier, after the colleague's own divorce had concluded. My colleague had described her in exactly one sentence. She doesn't perform outrage, she just wins. That was sufficient recommendation. I did not need a lawyer who would be angry on my behalf. I needed precision, strategy, and complete preparation. And from what I'd heard, Sandra brought all three without the unnecessary theater. Her office was on the 12th floor of a building in uptown Charlotte. Clean, minimal, the kind of space that communicates competence without trying to convince you of anything. She shook my hand when I came in, indicated the chair across from her desk, and said, "Tell me what you have." I put the legal pad and the printed records on her desk, all 61 pages, organized by date and tabbed by category: financial transfers, communication records, property and registration records, court filing documentation. She read through everything without asking a single question until she had finished. Her silence felt active rather than passive. Someone processing, not waiting. When she set the papers down, she folded her hands and looked at me directly. "The sealed filing is the piece that matters most," she said. "We can petition for access through the divorce proceedings. Given the financial trail you've documented, a judge will grant the petition. The pattern here is explicit, and the documentation is thorough." A brief pause. "You've done a significant portion of the preliminary work already." I told her it was similar in structure to what I did professionally. She nodded once. Then she asked me the question I had been thinking about carefully for 10 days. What outcome did I want? I wanted to leave completely and cleanly, without loose ends I hadn't agreed to. I wanted what was legally mine, including a full accounting of the hidden account. And most critically, I needed that account flagged and frozen before Joel was served with any paperwork and had any opportunity to move funds somewhere I could not trace them. "If we file this week," Sandra said, "we can have a temporary freeze in place within 10 days, before he has any reason to expect papers." That was exactly what I needed to hear, in exactly the right order. I drove home from her office in the early afternoon through the old streets of Dilworth, where the oaks arch over the pavement and the houses sit close to the sidewalk. The sky was doing that early spring thing, non-committal, hovering between grey and something almost blue, unable to fully commit to either. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. Through the kitchen window, the small frame was barely visible from this angle, a dark shape on the sill, catching a little of the pale afternoon light. Something that used to carry one meaning, sitting there now holding quite a different one, though outwardly unchanged. I went inside, made dinner. Joel came home and talked about a property showing that had gone well, and asked what we were eating, and I told him, and we ate. A completely ordinary evening, right down to the silences. I was very steady through all of it, and I had been practicing being steady for 10 days. The motion to access the sealed filing was granted 11 days after Sandra filed. The contents confirmed what I had already understood from the timing. 27 months ago, Cassandra had initiated a paternity proceeding. The child, a daughter, who had been 26 months old when the sealed agreement was finalized, had been confirmed through the court-ordered process. The sealed document outlined the private financial arrangement in specific terms: the monthly amount, the duration, the conditions under which it could be adjusted. All of it formalized. All of it kept deliberately out of any account or channel where I might have encountered it. a daughter, 26 months old. I sat with that information alone for a full day before doing anything else with it. Not because I was falling apart. I wasn't, but because a child deserves the weight of a full day's acknowledgement, even from someone who was on the opposite side of this situation from her. The formal meeting took place in Sandra's conference room on a Thursday afternoon in April. A long oval table, 8 upholstered grey chairs, windows along one wall looking out onto the concrete face of the parking structure next door. Joel came with his attorney, a man named Garrett who wore a good watch and was clearly used to being prepared. Sandra had requested, through proper channels, that Cassandra attend with her own separate legal representation. She came. She sat at the far end of the table and did not look at me when she came in. And she did not look at me for a long time after that. Sandra laid the documentation on the table methodically. Account records. Transfer history. Month by month. 26 rows. Hotel receipts cross. Referenced against the conference dates Joel had given me. Storage unit registration with its opening date. The email records, printed and organized. The unsealed filing with its dates, its amounts, its conditions. Each item placed without commentary. Just present. Just there, in the room, taking up space. Garrett made an initial statement about private arrangements and the appropriate jurisdiction of the proceedings. Sandra addressed his 2 points in 2 sentences and continued. Cassandra pressed both palms flat on the table at some point during the proceedings and looked down at her own hands. Her attorney said something quietly close to her ear. She gave a very small shake of her head and did not look up. Sandra continued through the remaining items on the documentation list. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes in total. Garrett made 3 more statements. Sandra addressed each one and moved the proceedings forward. Joel said nothing else after my 2 words. Cassandra did not speak at all for the remainder of the meeting. When it was over, we gathered our respective materials and people filed out in their separate directions. In the hallway outside the conference room, I waited for the elevator alone. Through the windows at the end of the hall, I could see the city doing its ordinary afternoon things. Traffic on the street below, a delivery truck double parked, 2 people standing outside a coffee shop looking at their phones. The complete indifferent normalcy of the world outside that building. At that same moment, the little wooden frame was sitting on the kitchen windowsill back at our house, in the grey afternoon, catching whatever light came through the window. Same as every other day, but I had already known before I left that morning that it would not be there when I got home. Some things you simply know are finished. The divorce was finalized 5 months and 3 days after Sandra filed the initial petition. The hidden account was classified as a marital asset, which Sandra had anticipated from the beginning and built the motion around from the start. The private arrangement with Cassandra was brought into the formal legal proceedings and restructured through the court, which meant it was no longer a secret transaction Joel could manage on his own terms, and the conditions of it were now part of the official record. His consultancy was audited as a standard component of the settlement process. Given the financial irregularities that had already been documented, the audit surfaced additional items that extended the proceedings by 6 weeks, but ultimately produced a settlement that was more complete than Sandra's initial estimate. He moved out on a Saturday in early June. 4 trips to his car, 2 bags, several boxes, the things that were clearly and only his. He didn't say much. I was in the backyard while it happened. I had been putting off replanting the raised vegetable bed near the back fence for 2 full seasons, and I finally did it that afternoon. Got down in the soil, worked with my hands, felt the particular grounding of doing physical work outside. I did not watch the door, Renata called that evening. She didn't ask how I was doing, which was the right call. She said, "Do you want dinner somewhere with a decent wine list?" We sat on a patio in Dilworth until almost 11 that night and talked about her daughter's end of year school situation, a book she was slowly working through, a weekend trip she was considering. Almost nothing about any of this, which was exactly what I needed. My mother called twice in the following weeks. I answered once. We were careful with each other, moved around the edges of the real things. She is not someone who moves naturally toward difficult subjects, and I honestly did not have the capacity in those weeks to guide her there. We talked about her garden, a documentary she'd watched, whether I was sleeping. I told her I was fine. That was true in all the ways I was able to discuss. Just then, Cassandra I did not speak to for 4 months. When she finally called, it was a Sunday morning, and I was standing at the kitchen counter, and I looked at her name on the screen for a long moment before I decided to answer. The conversation was short. She did not make excuses. I will give her that, honestly. She said she was sorry. She said she had made choices she could not undo, and that she understood if I chose never to speak to her again. I thought about it for a real moment, considered it, honestly. Then I told her I forgave her. Not because what happened was acceptable. Not because I had decided it didn't matter, or that the edges of it had softened. I forgave her because she is my sister, and she was younger, and she had been in a situation that someone else had constructed and managed, and carrying sustained anger toward her specifically was a weight I had decided, deliberately, not passively, that I was not going to carry into whatever came next. I said, I forgive you, Cass, but I need a long time before I can see you in person. She said that was fair. She said, thank you. We hung up. That month, I repainted the living room. The house felt different without his things in it. Not emptier, exactly, but more accurately sized, like a room where someone had finally removed furniture that had never quite fit the space. A deep, warm gray I had been considering for years, but that Joel had consistently redirected away from, in favor of the beige that had come with the house, which I had never genuinely liked, but had stopped noticing somewhere along the way. The way you stop noticing anything that has simply always been there. I spent most of one Saturday on it and finished the trim early Sunday. When I put the brush down and stood in the middle of the room in the late afternoon, I could smell the fresh paint and see the light landing differently on the walls. And I had one very quiet thought. This is just mine now. Not triumphant, not sad. Just a fact. Simple, clean, entirely true. 9 months later, on a Wednesday in February, I was standing at the kitchen sink a few minutes before 6 in the morning, waiting for coffee in the dark. The neighborhood was completely still. No one walking dogs yet, no cars, no sounds from the street, just the coffee maker running, and the furnace cycling on with its familiar low thud and the particular creak of the back door that happens every morning. When the temperature drops below a certain point, which I had long since come to think of as just the house making itself known, I was thinking about a client file I needed to review before a 9 o'clock call. Nothing complicated, just quarterly records that needed fresh eyes. Ordinary Wednesday morning thinking, the kind that doesn't take much from you. The new coffee maker sat where the old one had been. Different shape, clean white, no cracked handle, no electrical tape holding anything together. I had replaced it a few weeks after Joel moved out, and it had taken me an embarrassingly long time to stop reaching for the wrong switch out of habit. My hand moved along the windowsill above the sink and registered the empty space before my mind fully caught up. The photograph had been in the kitchen drawer since the evening of the conference room meeting. I had come home that day, walked directly to the kitchen, opened the drawer under the counter, and placed it inside face down without making any particular moment of it. No ceremony. Just done. I opened the drawer now and took it out and looked at it properly, standing there in the early dark. The hairline crack along the lower left corner of the plain wooden frame. Same as it had always been. The image, 2 people on a trail in Asheville, wind-burned and laughing, utterly certain from inside that photograph that they knew exactly who the other person was. I held it for a minute, just stood there with it in both hands, not with grief, not with anger, with something quieter, the feeling of looking at something from a sufficient distance that it no longer has the weight over you it once carried. I put it in the bag I was filling for the donation center, under some curtains I'd taken down, and a few books I'd already finished and wouldn't return to. Tied the bag, put it by the door. Outside the window, the backyard maple was completely bare the way it always is in February, all structure and no softness, every branch visible against the pale pre-dawn sky, the whole architecture of the thing exposed. I had watched that tree through enough seasons from this same window that I knew its schedule. Buds in late March. Always, No evidence of them yet. Nothing you could point to. But they were coming. I poured my coffee while it was still hot, which was something I'd had to consciously learn, to take things at the right moment, to not wait until they've already cooled, and then wonder why they're not warm. There is something on the other side of this kind of loss that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't reached it yet. It is not what you expect. It is not emptiness. And it is not some sudden new wholeness either. It is quieter than both of those. It is the particular feeling of a life that is simply and entirely yours. The absence of a weight you had stopped noticing you were carrying, which is the strangest kind of lightness, because you only feel it once it's gone. Here is what I keep coming back to, even now on ordinary mornings, when none of this is anywhere near the front of my mind. When someone manages your trust, that deliberately builds something across years, learns the specific edges of what you notice and what you let pass, keeps it all just far enough outside your line of sight. What does that say about how they understood you? And how many of us are living alongside a version of our own life that someone else has quietly and carefully edited? Because looking directly at the small inconsistencies feels harder than trusting the larger picture that's been arranged for us. I don't have clean answers. I'm not sure those questions have clean answers. What I know is this: the quietest decision I ever made turned out to produce the clearest outcome, not the confrontation, not the explosion that part of me on some evenings wanted very badly. The decision to sit down with a legal pad and build something solid and complete and undeniable before I moved a single inch forward. And when I finally moved, I was fully, entirely ready. Nothing was improvised. Nothing was left to the temperature of the room. The truth didn't need my fury to be true. It only needed time, and patience, and 61 pages of careful notes, and one attorney who did not waste mine. The quietest person in the room had already read everything. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story stayed with you, I would be honored if you shared it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and whether you have ever had to choose truth when silence would have been easier. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. I have many more to share, and I would love to have you here for the next one.